So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I am Jamie Moeller, and this is the Graduate Connection. And again, the goal here is to try to help graduate students do more than just survive. I want to see you thrive. And so, this is actually about the 7th week. I guess I've been bringing video content to you. Hopefully, you're finding this useful. I've gotten a variety of people that have given me feedback. I know a lot of people are watching it, and whether they comment on it or respond to it in any way, I guess I hope this is having an impact and bringing value to you. Again, I would encourage, if it's the first time you've seen these videos, go back and watch some of the other content. And I would encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, The Graduate Connection. I encourage you to engage, particularly if you're a graduate student. It doesn't matter whether you're at Purdue or elsewhere. If you're a graduate student, I'd encourage you to look up the Grad Connection private Facebook group, so that this is a place where graduate students can connect. A couple times a week, I try to engage there, and those who comment there, I try to engage a little bit to try to create a little bit of community for graduate students. Then ultimately, I suppose also you could friend me on Facebook or become a connection on LinkedIn. But however you choose to engage, hopefully you're finding this video content good. That's the kind of main thing, and hopefully it's more than just something to store between your ears. I hope that you're actually putting it into practice and using it in some way. And I would just I would offer that at any time, if I can help, as whether you're at Purdue or elsewhere, if I can help you navigate graduate education. That's kind of what has developed as my role at Purdue, is trying to help graduate students and graduate faculty navigate graduate education. So this week I had a little bit of, it was kind of a challenge. Early in the week, it's kind of like I don't necessarily know what I'm going to talk about in these videos until I kind of get to the end of the week and see what's really kind of, struck a chord with me at some point in the week. Well, what I want to bring today is, I wasn't originally planning on talking about this topic. But originally, there were a couple things that happened this week. I got into a conversation with a colleague, and we were talking about this one topic, and I've kind of integrated into today's thing. Long story short, what I want to talk about today is kind of continue this mentoring theme. But I want to talk about traits that you should look for, and not just positive traits. It's really the negative traits, to be able to recognize negative mentoring, because a lot of times it's really hard for us, I think, to recognize, because we can only judge by our range of experience and our sense of what might be quote unquote normal as far as an expectation. It's going to be based on our experience, and a lot of times our experiences may not be the best best thing to use as a judgment about what would be a typical or a good mentoring experience. And I mean, a lot of times I talk about the fact that, graduate faculty, when they create the environment for the graduate students, they replicate what they experienced. We do that as parents, right? Whether to some degree, we replicate, unless we consciously, purposely choose to to do it differently. If we just kind of live by default, we're gonna raise our children very much the way we were raised, whether that was good or bad. And oftentimes, we're not the best judges about what was good and bad until we hear about other people's experiences. It's really hard to judge our own. Anyway, so I want to talk about mentorship traits, and then I want to talk about mentorship malpractice, and then I want to take one more step and talk about detrimental research practices. So this kind of emerged early in the week. I said I was talking with this colleague, and we were talking about, I think a lot of times, you could talk about teachers, you could talk about people that are teaching, you could talk about people that are mentoring, you're talking about people that are faculty advisors. There's lots of roles that I think this applies to, but there's a significant difference between having a core in your being of care, that is, that you truly do care, that you're kind of like, you have a human services approach, a helping mentality, right? You have you find intrinsic satisfaction in helping. Teaching is a profession that the most successful teachers are the ones that really do have a core of care. I don't know how else to describe it. I mean, my wife's a nurse, and so, I mean, to me, that's a thing that's a driver for a lot of nurses. And there are lots of professions in which it's a caring profession. It's a profession that's driven out of a desire to help other people. So there's a difference between faculty mentorship and even engaging with teachers, where there's a core of care. And there's also sometimes you'll run into, and what I mean by that is sometimes you'll run into a person where there's not a core of care. It's not an issue of ability, it's an issue of desire, and it's an issue of they don't really care. and they have these negative traits where they really have a hard time caring about other human beings in a way that a mentor should, in the way that a teacher should, in a way that X should. But there's also a situation where I think there are a lot of people who have a core of care, but they don't know how to positively, normatively express that care in a way that's appropriate. It's kind of like you can tell they care, but they have a strange way of expressing it because oftentimes that's the way in which they've experienced it. Again, it comes back to this concept of we develop in our family unit and growing up in lots of different environments, we develop these ways in which we express care. The way in which we would express that to others in a healthy and particularly in a professional type environment, right? And so if you had a mentor, if you were mentored by a faculty member, by somebody who cared, but it kind of had awkward ways to express that, you're probably going to pick up those awkward expressions. And so there's a significant difference. When we talk about mentors, there's a significant difference between having a mentor that does have a core of care, but just doesn't know how to express it. It's kind of awkward and maybe, but you really know they care at a deep level versus those that truly don't care at all. And it's really hard to tell that because most people can put on a mask for a short period of time and appear like they care. And so this is one of the things when I talk with graduate students about, connecting in a laboratory or finding a major advisor or finding a degree program. It's more than finding a degree program that can accommodate what you want. It's more than finding someone who's doing the type of research that you want. It's also finding somebody that has a core of care and can hopefully express that in some reasonable way that connects with you. And so it's just, finding a place that you're going to thrive in as a graduate student requires connection, a degree that allows you to do what you want to do. I just lost it. A degree that allows you to do what you want it to do. A person who's doing the type of work that you want to do. And I think most importantly, a person who really cares about you and will foster, whether they know how to express it or not, that's different, right? But just knowing that there's a core of care. I found myself this week talking about, I talked about, sometimes you'll need a mentoring team, and one of the mentors that you're going to have, one of the types of people that you need on your team is a rock star, right? A superstar. Problem is most superstars and rock stars are, they sometimes don't care that much about the people that they're working with. You need them on your team, but you can't expect for them to be a coach. You can't expect for them to be a connector. I suppose part of them being a rock star is that rock star mentality of where they really don't care about other people. And I know there are people in every industry that don't have a core of care, but that's just a simple way for me to describe it. So first of all is understanding, kind of recognizing your mentor, which do they have a core of care for you? Now, in talking about this, I wanted to connect it with, I stumbled across, and again, I'm new to TikTok. I don't put any content on TikTok, but there's actually a lot of really good, there's some good content on TikTok. It's more than people just dancing and doing stupid and crazy stuff. There's actually some, now, I like to cook, and so there's lots of cooking recipes and all that kind of stuff, so a lot of that shows up in my list. There's also a variety of other kind of technical content, technical topics that appear. And I stumbled across this faculty member, and she's from somewhere in the East. I should have written down her name, but she had a short TikTok thing talking about internet trolls and the characteristics of them. And she talked about this thing that I had never heard of. Maybe it's just me, maybe I live under a rock or whatever, but she's talking about this thing called the dark tetrad of personality traits. And it's like, I'd never heard of that before. And so I wanted to dive into it, and I found it interesting. She was talking about it in terms of people that troll the internet, make negative comments and all those kinds of things. But I kind of made the leap over to honestly some of these characteristics faculty mentors exhibit. And so I want to describe these characteristics for you, and these should be red flags for you, right? Mentors probably shouldn't have these one or more of these attributes, and I suppose everybody to some degree has some of the attribute, but I'll park that and leave that. And I would encourage it. I'm going to put in the show notes some references to some materials on this I think that you might find useful. If I go back and I find the professor's name on TikTok, or I find out what her handle is or whatever, so I can put that in there, I'll put that in there for you, because I find she's got some really good stuff on social media networks, how you build a following, all those kinds of things. That's what she teaches, that's what she does, and there's some good stuff there. Anyway, dark tetrad of personality traits. The very first one is Machiavellianism. And so I would define this as, it's a person who is so focused on their own interests that they feel justified manipulating, deceiving, and exploiting others. And it's kind of like this ends justify the means kind of thing. But nevertheless, it's this kind of self-focused, self-centered, and all of these four attributes kind of have that attribute of inwardly focused, self-focused, self-centeredness. But this one is talking about, it's okay if I manipulate you, as long as, and honestly, I've seen this in mentors, right? Negative mentors, but mentors nonetheless, and I've heard it typically from the mentee, where the mentee has been manipulated because the professor thinks that they're better, obviously they're more along in their career, they've all that, but it doesn't justify them being Machiavellian, right? Of being manipulative for their own purposes, right? So that's personality trait one. Second personality trait is psychopathy. Basically, a person who has little to no empathy or remorse. You could describe them as antisocial and uninhibited egotism, right? And so, but to me, the defining characteristic when we talk about this is basically just somebody who has very little empathy or remorse, very little understanding of or appreciation or empathy for someone who's going through something else. As it relates to a graduate mentor to a graduate student, basically a graduate mentor who has no empathy for what a graduate student might be dealing with in their family or their situation or any of the other things, having to take classes and doing all this stuff at the same time. So that's the second characteristic, psychopathy. Third would be narcissism. And this is just pure unadulterated self-centeredness, right? Combined with the idea that I'm better than everybody else, that, everybody's underneath of me, right? That I can, it's all about me rather than what I can contribute to others. And then the last one is sadism, which is basically just at some level the concept of garnering pleasure from inflicting pain on others. Now, hopefully you can see that, these things describe a troll, as trolls on the internet, as this professor was talking about. But hopefully you can also see that these are kind of some drivers that would make for bad mentorship. And I have to say, having worked with lots of different graduate students over the years, particularly in the last 4 to 5 years, being in the graduate school at Purdue, and we have an office called the Office of Graduate Assistants, in which we try to help graduate students navigate these things, particularly and one of the most common things is when they're having difficulty with a major professor. And again, this is kind of where this idea of, one of the first things I do is trying to help coach through that kind of situation, is try to figure out, okay, is this a faculty member who has difficulty expressing care or just doesn't have any care at all? Is it a person who's has any of these 4 attributes that are showing up? And so as a graduate student looking for a mentor or in any kind of relationship, when you start to see these 4 things, these 4 attributes, and particularly when you start combining them and compounding them, where they start adding upon one another, you can see how toxic that could possibly be. So I think this dark tetrad of personality traits, again, I'll put some information in the show notes so that you can actually maybe find some, and you may have to end up having some institutional access to some journal articles, because most of what I'm going to probably refer you to are scholarly articles, because that's most of what I find, and there may be other things out there. But all right, so that's kind of the first thing. Is I've talked about the core of care relative to mentorship. I've talked about the dark tetrad of personality traits. Now let's move on and talk about something called mentoring malpractice. This is from an article by Chopra, Edelson, and Saint. It was from 2016. Again, I'll put it in the show notes. But essentially, and I agree with this, and I guess I took their definition and made my own. But my viewpoint of a mentorship relation, a mentorship relationship is a professional relationship, typically between a senior person and a junior person, that propels the career of both forward. A lot of times we have this perception that it only propels the career of the mentee forward, but the reality is it's a symbiotic relationship, and oftentimes the careers of both are propelled forward. Because there's got to be something in it for the mentor to want to do it, right? And the first and foremost driver of that needs to be a core of care, mind you. But there also has to be other professional benefits, I suppose. So, so that's kind of how I would define it. And we know, and this article talks about, and even at Purdue, Purdue several years ago put together a, and it's mostly undergraduate level where the focus was, but it was basically the Purdue Gallup index, which the goal was to kind of, okay, what makes the biggest impact on an undergraduate student's life as far as being able to be successful and finding it. I'm putting it in my own words. It's been a long time since I've read it and looked at it, but nevertheless, I don't know if I can find some information about the Purdue Gallup poll, I'll put it out there for you as well. And I'm sure there's information out there. But the whole goal was, what is it that propels a student forward? And it should be no surprise, it's basically having meaningful relationships with faculty, mentorship relationships with faculty. And this is kind of what, after that kind of came out, it's basically propelled forward that, one of the things that we look for in promotion and tenure relative to faculty is the evidence of mentorship. And so there's strong relationship between mentorship and, I'll just say, success in general, but particularly academic success. So that's how I define mentorship. So let's talk about what is mentorship. Mentorship malpractice then. Essentially, these are behaviors that threaten the success of the junior individual, and it's typically, in my opinion, through a misuse of the power differential that exists, because this is one of the biggest struggles that graduate students have, right? Is that you're working with a senior individual and you're putting a lot of hope and trust in that individual, and there's a power differential, and so it's very difficult if a problem arises. How do you address that? How do you address it in a way and such that it doesn't threaten your academic progress, threaten your assistantship or whatever funding model you're on, all of those kinds of things. So this article, it's actually titled "Mentoring Malpractice," goes on to talk about like three types of active mentoring malpractice and three types of passive mentoring malpractice. Right, and so I want to kind of quickly describe those. Again, I'll put in the show notes. I'll put the article itself. But so the first one is a hijacker, or someone who hijacks. Essentially, this is stealing a mentee's ideas. And my experience at working with graduate students is that this happens frequently. So a graduate student will come up with an idea. A graduate student is working in a particular lab. That idea gets co-opted by either the major professor or someone else in the lab. They get undercut, and it spins out of control. Most of the time, it's being driven by the major professor, because there's an idea, a core of an idea, and in a positive scenario where it doesn't end up becoming hijacking, the faculty member helps the student make that idea materialize. Whether that leads to a grant, whether that leads to publications, they may co-author it together. They may work together, and that's totally fine. But when I talk about a hijacking scenario, it's when the faculty member takes it and basically takes it from. And here I've heard lots of stories of students. Typically the most obvious one is in publications. So a graduate student does most of the work on a project, and then does the most of the work on the publication, and then the faculty member co-ops the publication in one of three ways. They either put themselves as the first author because they're the lead of the lab and they're the name that's known and blah blah blah, and that's wrong. Second would be basically subverting the first author position of the graduate student who did the most work by another graduate student who may be graduating earlier, or maybe the major professor owes that student something, and so this is the way they're going to pay it back. Again, wrong. And then the most egregious example that I've ever heard of hijacking is a student writing the publication, doing the project, and then their name not even appearing on the publication. So examples of hijacking. Exploiter is number two. Again, active malpractice. An exploiter basically straddling, these are my words, straddling, I think they're my words anyway. You can look in the article and tell me whether I'm right or not, but straddling a mentee with low impact tasks or activities, basically just loading them up with bullcrap. If you work in a bench lab scenario, just having the person clean beakers all day long and do menial tasks, where you just load them up with this. You just keep them busy, just taking care of minutia. So that's an exploiter. And I don't have a lot of examples like that where I've heard of graduate students. Recently I had a graduate student ask me the question of, is it common that graduate students should have to mop the floor in the lab, right? And now we're in the middle of COVID. And while that's not, something I would expect either a graduate student or a faculty to do, but under these emergency situations, as long as as long as everybody's taking a turn, including the faculty member, mind you, that'd be my opinion. Everybody's taking a turn at that. And as long as it's kind of like a short-term thing, as long as you're not being overly straddled with those kinds of things, okay. It's the other duties as assigned kind of thing that we oftentimes all of us get some of that, right? But if it were, too much of that, then it would fall into this exploiter realm. Possessor. Now, this one I see a lot with graduate students. Basically, it's domination of the mentee. Basically, the perspective that the mentor, and I hate to use this term, but it sounds good in my head. Hopefully, it won't offend anybody. But basically, the mentor owns the mentee and their time and whatever they do. I mean, I hear this is an example. This is something that I hear from a lot of graduate students, and it's very painful to hear. An example of it would be, graduate student is not having a good mentoring experience with a faculty member, or maybe in a positive way, maybe their research question shifts where somebody else would actually be the better chair for their committee or whatever. And this graduate student feels like they need to change chairs, and this chair is jealous at like, no, you can't leave me. I funded you for the last 2 years. You can't go on to someone else and work with. That's an example of a possessor, right? And a minute ago, I had another example of this kind of possessor idea, but it manifests itself in lots of different ways. But it's basically this idea that, you're my graduate student. You work for me, and you can't go do something else for someone else. And that's obviously a possessor role in active malpractice. So let's talk about passive malpractice then. So the article goes on to talk about 3. And again, I can give you examples probably for all of these. Bottleneck is the first one. Inattention to mentor needs by not making enough time. I see this a lot where a graduate student is waiting for a faculty member to review their article. Now, there's a balance point here. I mean, for a graduate student to expect that a faculty is going to turn around, a large manuscript in a matter of a week, particularly if you tell them on Monday that you need it on Friday, that's ridiculous. I mean, nobody can be an emergency on your part does not necessitate an emergency on my part. So planning is part of this. You can't so the mentee's expectation has to be right? It can't be unrealistic. But if the mentee has, and I've heard this is something that's come up a lot where a graduate student's written, waiting for feedback, let's say on a version of their thesis or dissertation or a paper or whatever. They provide it to the faculty. 2 weeks goes by, I haven't heard anything, kind of prod and nudge. 2 weeks go by, I haven't heard anything, prod and nudge. And 2 weeks go by. Now, that's the other side of this. That would be an example of what is described here as a bottleneck, which is passive mentoring malpractice. Number 2 under this category, under passive, would be a country clubber. I kind of find that phrase interesting. A country is basically somebody who wants to be a friend to everybody and doesn't necessarily want to have any kind of conflict with anybody. So, if something's going wrong in your research as a graduate student, or if some behavior you're doing is, long story short, if you're not making progress, a country club or faculty would just keep giving you satisfactories on your research credit and just let you go on forever without making any progress. Or maybe they're afraid to, and I say afraid, it's really, it is really a fear of conflict. It's being conflict averse. And there are a lot of faculty members that are, and there are a lot of just general people that are conflict averse. Conflict is not fun, but it's necessary for relational growth and personal growth. I mean, there ought to be some fireworks sometimes in some relationships. That firework, there ought to be some sharpening of one another if there's no disagreement, and if there's not a healthy way to disagree. And there's some tools that you can use as a graduate student. If there's any interest, I'll do a video, and it's one of the topics that I actually have in my book. When I meet a lot of graduate students, there's this thing called the conflict communication wheel. I didn't create this. This is something that an executive coach shared with me long ago. But it's a process by which that gives you a mechanism by which to address, first of all, problems in a relationship, and then addressing how it makes you think and feel, and then how do you get what you need in your relationship. So anyway, if there's interest, let me know, and I'll talk about that in a subsequent video. It's a really handy tool. I like scripts. Dealing with difficult situations, I like scripts that I can walk through because I think it's helpful. But anyway, not to digress. So country clubber, avoiding conflict and really never telling you the truth about your performance, your behavior, things that are maybe holding you back as a graduate student or even professionally. And then the last one is something that they term a world traveler. Essentially, somebody who's never present, kind of takes a laissez-faire approach to mentoring. It's not really there when you need them. And when it comes to faculty dealing with graduate students, oftentimes this can be problematic because oftentimes your rock star faculty members that are highly successful as it relates to research and elsewise, part of that is a lot of traveling. And it's not a bad thing if a faculty member has to travel and all that, but there has to be some mechanism by which the mentee and the mentor can connect. So those are kind of I guess those are 6 kind of examples of mentoring malpractice provided by the article. And then they go on to talk about, some prevention. So first of all, don't settle or don't be complicit. Don't just kind of accept that this is your lot. I mean, if you get to the point with a graduate faculty member that you need to switch because the mentorship is toxic, or and realize at Purdue, there's the Office of Graduate Assistants that can help you with that. If you're at another institution, another university, or somewhere else, find a way to navigate out of that. I mean, if you are in a toxic mentoring relationship or a non-existent mentoring relationship, right, more of the passive as opposed to the active, find a way out of that. And there are people that can help you do that in most cases. Set any mentoring relationship you get into, set boundaries and define communication needs. One of the things that graduate students often talk about is oversharing. And I think sometimes, and this goes back to this core of care versus the ability to express that care. I think sometimes graduate faculty want to develop a professional relationship, and because maybe they don't have the best way to express that, they maybe overshare about family, about life, about thoughts, about work, about whatever. And so you might need to establish some boundaries about things you want to talk about and things you don't want to talk about with your mentor. And it's totally okay that if a mentoring conversation starts to go down a path that makes you uncomfortable, it's okay to address that and just say, I'd really like to just keep our mentoring conversations about this. I appreciate your thoughts in that area, but it's probably ancillary to where we're going. Third is something that I talked about last week, which is establishing a mentorship team. So I'm not going to go into deep depth there. And then lastly, knowing when to walk away. And this comes back to that communication wheel that I was talking about. Is, the end of that process is basically where you kind of know whether you should stay in the relationship or not, because you can kind of know whether your needs are being met or not. So anyway, so that's the article, right? So that's that article. Now I want to, as I said, we're talking about this core of care. We're talking about basically the dark tetrad personality traits you should be aware of and beware of in both cases. Be aware and beware of. And then we talked about malpractice. And now I want to finish the last topic, which is detrimental research practices. So I'm kind of putting on I serve as the research integrity officer at Purdue. And so I'm kind of putting that hat on because this is a topic that I typically talk about there. But to me, it's kind of like these things are different pieces of all the same puzzle, right? And so I'm trying to give you, hopefully what you take away from this is kind of a sense for what might be abnormal or not the best mentoring practices. And so when we talk about these mentoring malpractice, detrimental research practices are oftentimes things that are precursors to research misconduct. A really good article, and I'll put it in the show notes. It's by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics. It was published, I think, in 2016. I think I wrote 17 here, but I think it was 16. Anyway, it's called Fostering Integrity in Research. It's an online PDF that you can order the book. It's a little expensive. You can just download the PDF, but it has a lot of information in there about research misconduct and particularly about detrimental research practices. So what's a detrimental research practice? Essentially, it's a behavior of questionable integrity that does not rise to the level of research misconduct. Now, I will say oftentimes DRPs are a precursor to research misconduct. And there's 3 categories of these as defined by the NASM. And so first is misrepresentation. So what are some examples? So misrepresentation, purposeful suppression or flawed interpretation of data, undisclosed duplication of publication. So in other words, an example of that might be if you were to submit the same publication to 2 places at the same time, which is kind of a no-no, or publishing it here and then not modifying it or modifying it very little before you submit it somewhere else and calling it original research in both places. Failure to disclose conflicts of interest, whether that be financial or professional or personal. Misrepresentation of qualifications. experience or positions, right? So saying that you have a degree that you don't have, or saying that you have been at a position that you weren't at, that kind of thing. And then lastly, and most importantly for graduate students, is this concept of misrepresentation in authorship involvement. And so that can be misrepresentation. There can be negative practices of gift, guest, or ghost authorship practices. So a gift authorship would be, okay, if you let me use your data set, I'll make you a co-author. That's gift. It's like a quid quo pro kind of thing. Guest authorship would be putting somebody on a publication because they're a big name, and you believe that your paper might get accepted because they're on it, even though they had nothing to do with the project and or nothing to do with the paper. And lastly would be ghost authorship, right? So basically authoring something under the auspices of someone else, or authoring something for someone else, right? And when we talk about ghost authorship, that could also be payment, that you basically paying to have something written for you, would be another example. And then the last part about authorship would be denial of authorship or denial of credit. So I see this sometimes with in the graduate realm, where a graduate student has been involved on a publication, or somebody was involved with the project, but then they're excluded from the paper or the publication. In other words, they're not even given they should be at least given the right of first refusal, right? So that's an example of misrepresentation. Second major area is breach of duty care, and most of this has to do with the logistics of research. Accidentally disclosing participants, because participants in a research study are supposed to remain anonymous, putting participants in danger, not taking care of participants by not giving them informed consent, or those kinds of things, ignoring the legal or ethical requirements for the use of animals, organs, tissues, materials, all those kinds of things. And then lastly, improper conduct in peer review. Basically, in a peer review scenario, everything's supposed to be confidential. And what I would mean here is basically participating in a peer review, you see an idea and it gets denied publication, and so then you take that idea and you actually operate on it using the knowledge that you got from peer review, and that's no. And then the last area is improper dealings with allegations, right? So to me, this has, as graduate students, you can have something to do with this, I suppose. So failing to address infringements, so in other words, covering up research misconduct, not protect, and this is more institutionally, but not protecting whistleblowers. And then lastly, failing to deal with malicious allegations. So, anytime there's a research misconduct allegation, it's assumed to be in good faith. So if somebody's just doing that as a retaliatory action, or just out of meanness and not out of good faith, this would be, the example here would be not dealing with that. So again, all of these things are from, it's more of like a technical report from National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. I might have said mathematics a minute ago, so if I did, I apologize. Anyway, so all of this, what's your takeaway? As a graduate student, hopefully this video has kind of defined what healthy mentoring should look like by talking about negative mentoring, talking about the negative attributes or negative things that you can see. And to some degree, I guess you could say that these attributes also, it goes beyond just the mentoring relationship. We talk about the Tetrad of dark personality traits. That goes with any kind of relationship, I suppose. But anyway, hopefully you get that taken. So the takeaway is, what's healthy mentoring look like, or what does non-healthy mentoring look like, is probably a better way to describe it. Second would be, how do you address mentoring deficiency? So, at Purdue, one of the ways that you would do that is to kind of work with the graduate school. So if you have difficulty with mentors that you have, graduate faculty or whatever, if you're another institution, figure out a path to try to address that or deal with it. I didn't say it at the end of talking about detrimental research practices, but again, if that's something that you observe or experience in your work, if you're at Purdue, then the way you would report that is first and foremost, probably the best place is the graduate school, but you could also report it to me as the research integrity officer. At whatever institution you're at, usually there's some kind of compliance officer that you can report such things to. And so those are kind of the takeaways that I hope that you get from this. It's kind of a, probably this is, of the videos I've done thus far, this one's probably the most, I feel like it's most deep dive for graduate students. Hopefully if you're not a graduate student, some of this would be helpful. But again, I'm going to kind of stay the course on, my main intent is to deliver content for graduate students, and again, try to help them do more than just survive. So many of the times when I talk with graduate students, I can just kind of see it in their body language. I can see it in their face, and even hear it as they talk. Is that oftentimes it's very challenging for them to feel like they're thriving. They feel like it's an uphill battle, that they're sometimes hanging by a thread, and that kind of thing. And those kind of statements really resonate with graduate students. And I acknowledge the pucker factor is pretty high for graduate students, balancing lots of different things and really in the most powerless position in most of our academic institutions. They shoulder an incredible burden relative to teaching and research, and it's the oil that keeps the engine running as far as the institution is concerned. Without graduate students, most of your R1 institutions and most of the research wouldn't happen. So I humbly acknowledge that, and it's kind of my heart. It's kind of my why for doing these videos, because I just working with graduate students day in, day out, I see these things every day. And I want to, it's kind of my life mission. My whole why is just to see graduate students, I want to see them, go on to successful careers and try to make their time at the academic institution, particularly Purdue, as fruitful as possible. So with that, I hope you have a great day. As I said, as I've been talking about, most of the time I'm releasing these videos on Fridays. I guess I kind of like it. I kind of like doing them on Fridays because I get to the end of the week and it's kind of like I can see what has resonated with me, and it also kind of hopefully gives folks an opportunity to view this material over a weekend. So given that this is a Friday as normal, I'll wish you a great Friday, and I hope the rest of your weekend is healthy, happy, and successful. So with that, have a great day.